Thanks for attending. We are now kind of presenting again the work that was done in Work Package 4, which was on the territorial impacts of agro-ecological farming practices and food system transformation in the European Union in 2050. I will again resume the kind of the assumptions that were behind the presentation that I gave today in the morning. And then Ellen, Adrian, and Sean will present their work on 5 consistent scenario narratives and the quantification of these narratives. And then we have like 15 to 20 minutes time for discussion. So, okay, so I'm going through the slides once more, emphasizing different results, and then we'll dig more into the socio-economic impacts. So in this assessment of the 420 future agri-food scenarios in the EU, we modeled the land feasibility of a large number of conventional and agro-ecological scenarios in a multidimensional scenario framework. So we assume no further deforestation and grassland change to cropland within the European Union in 2050 in all agro-ecological scenarios. It's again important to acknowledge that these scenarios are neither driven by desirability nor by likeliness, but only driven by the combination of different parameters in the agri-food system, which were derived or inspired by the case studies. So for example, we have 2 distinct pathways for farming systems. Current livestock production patterns, which is the conventional pathway, these are always marked in red, and an agro-ecological one where we better align crop and livestock production with feed production potentials. These are marked in green. So the figure below shows the conceptual approach for the conventional pathway, where we assume a continuation of the current livestock production patterns as they are in the EU, with high feed imports and often not aligned with domestic agricultural land. This is a kind of a business as usual assumption, meaning that the distribution of livestock systems in the EU remains as they were in the base year. For the agro-ecological pathway, we align livestock systems with feed production potentials at the NUTS2 level within the EU. So regions that have large production potentials from grassland receive a higher share in the EU production of ruminant livestock, and for monogastrics, we redistribute them according to cropland feed potentials within the EU. And now go again through all the food system parameters we have included in the assessment. So each agro-ecological pathway, which are marked in green, comprises one specific or a bundle of agro-ecological practices for different agricultural and food system compartments. So these are ruminant livestock diets, for example, a shift towards more cropland byproducts and roughage in the agro-ecological variant. So we thus assume reduced food feed competition. The second assumption is purely grass-based livestock diets and roughage from cropland. For example, clover, which in some scenarios comes from undersowing in cereals. The conventional variant, we actually assume current livestock diet and efficiencies, while the efficiencies are improved a little bit. Monogastric diets and manure management, there we include more outdoor systems, which is beneficial for animal welfare, and an increase in biogas digester systems. So biogas digester systems are not agroecology kind of in the core, but we include it since it allows to decrease emissions and prevent overspreading of surplus manure on croplands and on grasslands. We only assume it in a rather limited share of systems, not in all monogastric systems in the EU. Then cropland yields, there we have conventional yields, which are derived from one of the most recent FAO outlooks, and comparatively lower agroecological yield variants. In the agroecological yields, or these are parameterized by reducing conventional organic yield gaps, which we derive from publications from Fonisio, Seufert, or the TÜVE report, by 50%. So we assume smaller yield gaps between conventional and agroecological farming. We also allow for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer if insufficient nitrogen is provided by manure and N fixation from legumes, where we assume approximately 50 to 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Then for cropland expansion, in the conventional variant, we assume a 20% expansion of cropland into grasslands if needed, and only if enough high quality or high productivity grassland is available, which can easily be converted to cropland. In the agro-ecological variant, we do not allow for such a cropland expansion, and we further assumed in the two agro-ecological scenarios one variant where we implement a minimum of 7% of hedgerows on cropland in the year 2012, so on the amount of cropland in the year 2012. So if less cropland is used in the future, this share increases. And the second pathway is where we assume undersowing in cereals, in cereal production with clover and maize, where parts of them are ploughed into the soil and one share is also fed to ruminant livestock. And we also assume a full shift towards fodder legumes, so alfalfa production instead of fodder maize or fodder roots production. For grassland utilization, we have a land sharing and a land sparing variant or pathway. Land sharing means that grassland extent remains same as in the base year, but grazing intensities are adapted to match the demand. And in the land sparing variant, actually, we increase grazing intensity on highly productive land and consolidate livestock there on this land until the maximum sustainable thresholds are reached. And these maximum sustainable thresholds are different based on kind of what we call them grazing classes, so high quality grassland or rather low quality grasslands. Then we have allowances for the maximum sustainable grazing intensities, and we reduced these thresholds by 20% in high natural value farmland in the agroecological pathways. And last but not least, we assume dietary changes in the European Union and reduced food waste and losses. So the healthy diets are based on a publication from Willett and colleagues, the so-called Lancet diets, and there we have one form, which is kind of the Lancet diet as proposed in this paper, and one where we actually include more ruminant meat instead of monogastrics products. We also assume a 50% reduction of current waste and losses in the agroecological pathways. So all combinations result in a total number of 420 scenarios. And I also have to add that BioBAM, which is the model that we used here, is a global model, but we zoomed into the European Union. I've only shown, and I will only show results for the EU, but the global results are available too. So we embedded the agroecological shift in Europe into a global model where we assume kind of a business as usual scenario for the rest of the world countries. So clearly, all these kind of pathways that we have implemented are kind of prototypes, and we upscaled them without taking into account local particularities. But we use conservative approaches for most assumptions. Clearly, this is not the case for the land sparing variant, where we assume that the whole free cropland and grassland is afforested. But this approach quite well shows what would happen if this would happen. So if regional characteristics are taken into account, so for example, limits to a forested grassland, this can be taken into account in the future. So considering these needs to be a next step. So I will now show one more additional result from the morning session. So we here show a heat map for cropland extent in 36 scenarios. So each colored quadrant is a scenario. Each of the large quadrats here is one specific human diet, from left to right. A business as usual diet, two healthy and sustainable diets within the EU, referred to as Lancet diets, and a sustainable diet derived from the most recent FAO outlook. Each column in each large quadrant is a specific livestock diet and feed conversion efficiency bundle. And each row is a specific cropland management variant. So as you see here, hedges, then cropland feed, which is kind of undersowing in cereals, and the shift to fodder legumes, and a conventional or a business as usual cropland management variant. And finally, manure management and grassland variants do not influence cropland extent, so are not shown separately here. So please remember that this is only cropland and not total agricultural land. So we see that less cropland than in the base year is sufficient to cover the demand in 2050 in all agro-ecological scenarios we assessed here. So the full implementation of these agro-ecological practices or practice bundles is possible. However, if only production side measures are taken and demand, so diets and food wastes, develop according to a business as usual scenario, cropland extent remains high and import dependency might increase. Or in some scenarios even exceeds the extent in the base year, so the cropland extent. This can be seen in the red quadrants on the left, where you see that cropland is even increasing above the current cropland extent. So you may remember the statement I made in the morning about the no regret option. And this is, for example, what I meant with that. So a reduction in diets would allow increases, or a reduction in diets increases the scope to implement agro-ecological measures on cropland. Okay, and now I hand over to you, Ellen.
Andreas. So I will now speak a little bit more about these storylines that we developed together with stakeholders as part of this work package. So Andreas showed you all the 420 scenarios that were a result of all the different combinations of these production side and demand side variables. And what we tried to do in the stakeholder process was to think about in what futures different combinations of these can play out, and what are the drivers that would lead to different types of developments and the outcomes then. So trying to look a little bit more into how things could potentially develop to put some more flesh on these more quantitative scenarios. So this was done in a stakeholder-driven process where we developed these 5 storylines, and the storylines are small stories about the future, examples of how the future could develop, and these are described in text in one of the deliverables, and I will also present them very shortly here. And to these qualitative stories about the future, we added then some quantitative outcomes in terms of land, self-sufficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on, using the same model. And why do we do this? Why do we develop these storylines? Well, it's to help envision these contrasting developments, and also to discuss what could be the drivers that lead to different outcomes. And then also, I mean, in the end, to facilitate effective decision making now. So the decisions we take now, of course, will lead to different outcomes going further. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So the first step in doing this is to identify the major uncertainties that we face, and those are, of course, many. And for those of you who are familiar with scenario development, you will recognize such a scenario cross, which is a common and straightforward way to develop scenarios. So the uncertainties that we chose after having discussed this quite a lot with stakeholders, well, maybe the first one was given. It was about, I mean, to what level do we implement agroecology? And that's, of course, because this whole project is about the implementation of agroecology. So that was kind of given. But the next uncertainty that we chose in the end was this, whether we, organize our food systems globally or more locally, because that determines a lot of things related to trade and what we produce and so on. So that is a crucial uncertainty that we just chose to consider. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So out of this uncertainties, then the different storylines emerge. So if we look at the first one, which is a combination then of a global food system and a low level of agroecology, that's where we have our business as usual scenario. So that reflects quite well the current situation and the current developments. I will talk a little bit more about each of these, but I'll just go through them all first here. So the second one, the orange one, we have a combination of a global food system and a high level of implementation of agroecology. And here, this is driven by using agroecology as a way to expand export opportunities. Going up to the blue, we have two storylines where we have a combination of local food systems and a low level of implementation of agroecology. And the green one, the final one, is a combination of a local food system and agroecology. Okay, can I have the next one? So the business as usual one then, we imagine that the globalization of the food system continues, and that farmers are much as today incentivized to produce low value commodities, and that this leads to further specialization of farming systems and regions. And we also assume here that current production and consumption trends in the EU continue. So this is very much a baseline where we see current trends continuing into the future. Okay, can I have the next one, please? So this one then, a combination of still a globalized food system, but with a high level of agroecology. Here we see, as I said, this being driven by the export opportunities that the high value products from these agroecological farming systems are. So we see a substantial expansion of agroecology, but then mostly for products that we export, and we have had many interesting discussions during the project and in workshops what these products could be. So here, I mean, agroecology is implemented mainly for these export opportunities for growth and continued production increases in the EU, and not so much maybe by sustainability. So here we also in this scenario allow for some cropland expansion to further increase production and the growth in the agricultural sector. Okay, can I have the next one, please? So this one, which is a combination then of a local food system and low level of implementation of agroecology. So here we see this as a rise in nationalism and protectionism. So here the focus is on national security, national self-sufficiency, and that's given priority over how food is produced. So it's more important here for food to be local than coming from agroecological systems or other sustainable farming systems. So I mean, of course, some countries, they have had this focus already for a long time, like Finland, for example, but we also see, for example, in Sweden, where I'm from, that this has changed over just the last years. We've seen that this focus has shifted towards this focus on self-sufficiency, that's being much more important now in Sweden. It has been a non-issue for many years, but now with COVID, with insecurity in the world in general, we see this rise. And so in this scenario, focus would be on increased production of bulk commodities to supply the local markets. And there's no specific focus on sustainability, so diets, levels of waste, and so on continue according to business as usual projections. Okay, next one, please. So this one is a storyline that is found in the same scenario quadrant. So it's a localized food system with low level of agroecology, but here not driven so much by nationalism, but rather by a genuine will to move towards more sustainable food systems, but not maybe through agroecology in this case, but more through sustainable intensification, trust in technology, and so on. So we see in this storyline a moderate implementation of agroecology and a bigger focus on using technologies to solve the sustainability challenges. But since we have a focus here on sustainability in general, diets also change towards more plant-based and waste is reduced. Okay, next one, please. So the last one is the local agro-ecological food system. And here we see that this is driven by an increase among the population driven by concerns in terms of climate and environmental protection. So preferences here among the population changes drastically to kind of ask for this future. So quite a large large area is now farmed with agroecological practices and then serving local markets in this storyline. And this increased awareness among the population is also leading to healthier and more sustainable diets that are also more aligned to the local availability of different foods. And livestock systems change quite a lot here. So we see a reduction in pig and poultry primarily because these species eat what we as humans can eat directly, while we have still quite some ruminant production, but that is mainly then grass-based in this scenario. So as I said, you can read a fuller description of these storylines in the deliverable. And in this deliverable 4.2, there's also the modeling results. So Andreas and the team, they model the outcomes of these different storylines. So if you can move to the next, I'll just show you some examples. So to the left there, we have, first of all, this land-based self-sufficiency that Andreas also talked about in the morning. So what that means is whether the land, the local available land in an area and in a region, in a country, can supply the local demand. So if you have a certain demand for a certain amount of food, is there enough land in the area to supply that? And as you can see, the blue bar to the left is 2012 situation. So there it's in 2012, the EU could supply the EU population with the food. And if you see then how it increases a bit with the business as usual scenario because of increases in yields and productivity. And if you look at the red and the green bars to the right there, you see that there we have a huge increase in this self-sufficiency, which means that in these scenarios, which are the sustainable scenarios where diets change a lot, the total demand of biomass is reduced, and the EU land can supply even more food. So if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions in the middle, you see that in the business as usual compared to the 2012, if you compare the blue and the gray, you see an increase in emissions, and also for the agroecology for exports. So in the business as usual, in the agroecology for exports, production increases, and we have increases in emissions. But if we instead go for the more sustainable scenarios where diets are changed with less meat, we see a drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the red and the green bar. And to the right, you can also see that if we use the land that is freed from the reduction in demand to regrow vegetation, we could actually reach negative emissions. So sequestering a lot of carbon to actually then cancel the agricultural emissions and even reach net negative emissions. So there's a huge potential in terms of climate mitigation to moving to less livestock intensive diets. Okay, so this is just to give you a teaser of all the regional assessments that Andreas and the team did for these different scenarios. So these are modeled down to the NUTS 2 level. So this shows how this land-based self-sufficiency plays out in different regions. So if it's a green region, it can supply, or if it's yellow, it can yellow and above, it can supply the population with the local population with food from the land. But if it's red, it cannot. And as you can see, in 2012, you see that we had quite some red regions. It will improve a bit with the business as usual development because of increases in yields and productivity. If we go for the agroecology for export, so there's some decreases in yields, but still the same demand for food because we don't change the diets. Even more areas will turn red. And you see for the local agro-ecological food system where we also change diets, there's quite some improvement in this regional land-based self-sufficiency. Okay, thank you.
Okay, then I will shortly present some additional results which complement this biophysical focus. We also calculated some more social economic indicators covering labor productivity, also animal welfare and so on. I will here now shortly focus on labor and labor productivity. And the aim here is also to illustrate whether on this level may arise particular trade-offs between different sustainability indicators, or like between improvements on the environmental side and the potential maybe drop in rural jobs and so on. And as these models are built, we have to be aware of that these indicators, the further away we go from the biophysical ones, the more aggregate, the more gross they get, but they still give an indication of the patterns we may see. And so now looking at the labor, here again, you have these 5 scenarios. And to the very left, we have the business as usual 2050. Then we have the local for protection. The gray one is the agroecology for export. So this is the focus on high value agroecological products that are exported. Then we have the local for sustainability and the agroecological food systems. And what is displayed is here always the ratio between the value in the scenario to the value in the baseline 2012. And we see here in general that that's the bottom line, the total labor input is slightly higher in the scenarios. And this is comes into very different patterns for crop and livestock production. To the upper left, you see the crop production, which increases considerably, and correspondingly the labor input also is increased. And to the right, you see the livestock production, or the labor input to livestock production, which decreases considerably, in particular for the really agroecological scenarios, because of this drop in animal source food in the diets and animal production. And this drop in labor use in the livestock sector is somewhat overcompensated by the increase in the crop sector. So overall, the labor use in these scenarios doesn't drop on aggregate, but we have to clearly see that there are quite strong regional differences, and this is owed to the specific production patterns that prevail in the different regions. And so on a more regional level, it can play out with more sort of drastic changes towards reduced or increased labor needs. So this reflects also these shifts in production we have on the sort of the biophysical side, because, for example, livestock is produced where it can be produced best. So where there are more grasslands, there is more cattle, and the monogastrics are rather where the cropland potential is higher, but in total, the monogastrics are anyway lower in this agro-ecological scenario. So this again reflects this general pattern of smaller food systems in the agroecological scenarios, in particular on the livestock side. Next, please. And we also looked at the producer value, again, a very gross indication what this means. And again, we see that in total, the value that's again on the bottom, at the bottom, doesn't drop on average. And in this agroecology for export scenario, the production value also increases considerably. This reflects the strategy to produce high value crops for export. But again, we have this pattern that the value production in the livestock sector drops considerably, and in the crop sector it increases. So this again reflects this general pattern. And if we combine it, then we get a very gross, so next slide, please, a very gross indication of labor productivity, which we also see that it, on average, somewhat drops, but not too drastically on average. Still, we have the regional variations, which can be quite strong, and we have some outliers here, which we have to dig deeper into what they mean. But on average, we see that regarding labor productivity and also the other indicators that are at the basis, the agroecological scenarios are on average viable. So we do not have a huge drop in labor productivity or job use or value production. And that's sort of the type of results we aim at when looking at such type of indicators complementing the biophysical assessments. Whether regarding these indicators, the different scenarios will pose particular and strong challenges, or whether they are rather viable or even can offer new opportunities. And we had also another approach to assess the economic contents of the scenarios, and I will hand over to Sean to present this.
Thanks, Adrian. So yes, I'll talk a bit about the economic modeling now. So just to introduce what we did, so we took the output from the biophysical models, which is basically quantities produced of different food items in different scenarios, and we made an economic model that basically could tell us what kind of policies would we need in order to match those quantities from the biophysical model, and what would be the resulting prices and impacts on prices, and also impacts on economic welfare for producers and consumers. And so we had to match the data on EU imports, exports, production, and consumption. And so to do that, we basically needed 3 policy instruments, and those were an EU production tax or subsidy, a consumption tax or subsidy, and an import tariff in the EU. And so that's basically, with those policy instruments, we were able to match the quantity data and then arrive at some predictions for prices and economic welfare impacts. I just wanted to mention a few caveats before I show you or discuss the results. The one thing was that, so basically what we're doing here is modeling the policies required to reach this desired production, consumption, and trade quantities. But we're not necessarily modeling the policies to induce agro-ecological production methods. And so those are actually covered more in another work package. And another thing is that when we look at welfare, we're basically looking at the welfare from consumption that does not include any possible welfare benefits that consumers get in terms of ecological services. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention as well. So now we can move to the next slide where we talk about the main results. So in a nutshell, these moving from business as usual in 2050 to different alternative storylines generally leads to higher prices for most goods and lower economic welfare for most commodities as well. And really, one important thing so we find some negative impacts in terms of economic impacts. But one thing that's important to remember here is that the results are very sensitive to how responsive future production is to policies. So what I mean here is basically the elasticity of supply, which is basically how describes the relationship between production supplied and the price. So if supply is highly responsive or elastic, then we actually would just need in order to match the biophysical quantities, we just need small price and welfare impacts. Whereas if supply is quite non-responsive to price, then we would need a really big change in prices and welfare impacts to reach these agroecology scenarios. So it does really hinge on the slope of the supply curve, as it's called, which basically says how responsive is supply to price and market. Next slide, please. And just to give you a few takeaways from the economic modeling. So one thing that we find is that these storylines require, for the most part, quite fundamental shifts in production and consumption. And so that in order to get to those lower levels of production and consumption, we need quite large policies, quite radical policies. Some of them would clearly be, not comply with WTO, for instance, the import tariffs that we need in order to get to these trade numbers. And so it seems like it might be infeasible to reach agroecology using purely market-based economic policies. It's important, I think, we'd have to have consumer preferences changing, so diets would really be important. And also, it would seem to be that production mandates might be more feasible than using taxes or subsidies to get here. And what I mentioned earlier about the sensitivity of the supply, the slope of the supply curve means that we really need to, in order to make things easier for us to reach these different storylines, we need to really flatten the supply curve. Everybody's talking about flattening the curve these days, so I'm going to talk about flattening the supply curve. And that means basically that production systems need to be flexible and responsive to market conditions, and so that technology can adapt to the changing circumstances. So I think technology would help us to get here. And that's it for the economic part. I guess now I'll pass it over to Andreas to wrap it up here. I think you're muted though.
Okay, now. Thanks for your presentation. So I'll conclude with some final take-home messages for you, the messages that I already presented in the morning. So an agroecological transformation in the EU can be how I frame it, a no-regret option. But without changes in diets, this would put additional pressure on agriculture in the rest of the world, and thus carries the risk of exporting environmental pressure to other regions beyond the EU. Secondly, particularly healthy low-meat diets and less food waste allow for several important measures. The first one is increasing self-sufficiency. The second one are these nature-based climate solutions, such as afforestation on free crop and grassland, or general extensification of crop yields, bringing a lot of many other environmental benefits and an improvement in ecological services. And lastly, to secure a kind of agricultural reserves for the future if they are needed. So for example, if climate change is hitting harder than expected, then kind of these reserves can be utilized for food production. And the third one is that the biggest effects relate to changes that address the total production and not on improving efficiencies. So not on kind of continuing basic patterns. Right now, proving here and there, improving efficiencies and putting a bit of agroecology on top. So this is not going to work. The biggest effects relate to the changes in the total production volume. Okay, so that's it from my side for the presentation.